Hello, my name's Madeleine Kessler and I'm an architect. My background's mostly in sort of cultural and civic projects, and I really enjoy working with local communities to really sort of understand their areas and what we can do to rethink public space. I'm the co-curator of the British Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale this year, with a project called the Garden of Privatised Delights, where we're exploring privatised public space across the United Kingdom. And I'm also a director of my own practice, Madeleine Kessler Architecture, and a co-founder of Unseen Architecture. Well, my background's in both architecture and engineering, and I think I've always been really interested in how people use the city and sort of people being really the core of design. You know, everything that's around us is for the people that live in it and who inhabit it. And looking at these relationships between people and nature, people from different walks of life, intergenerational relationships, and how we can sort of create places that allow everyone to live together and come together, meet one another, bump into one another. And that's really sort of the core of my work. So our project for the British Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale is looking at privatised public space across the United Kingdom. And I'm curating the pavilion with Manager Verghese. And our interest in privatised public space really came out of a summer school we taught together in 2015 at the Architectural Association, where we were looking at the pub as an example of privatised public space, which is often overlooked because it's an interior. And we were really interested in how, when often people think of privatised public space, they think of these sort of grey paved squares and new developments. When in fact, it's not a new thing. Privatised public space is something that goes back sort of generations within our culture. Within the United Kingdom. And so we were looking at how we could start to sort of navigate this middle ground and this territory that kind of looks at this boundary between public and private. Yeah, so within the British Pavilion, we've taken the six rooms of the pavilion and we've given each one a theme around privatised public space. So we've taken four different types of privatised public space from across the United Kingdom. And so those are the Garden Square, the pub, the High Street, and the youth centre. And they're really looking at these spaces that are under threat, and how can we reinterpret them for the 21st century. You know, how do we actually open up our garden squares to make them more inclusive? You know, these amazing kind of oases in the city which are often completely underused. How do we save the pub and allow it to become a place that's much more than just a watering hole? How do we rethink the high street to ensure that it maintains these kind of really important social uses within it? And how do we create places for young people when there's just nowhere in the city for them to go anymore? And then on top of that, we've overlaid these two government ministries, which are the Ministry of Common Land and the Ministry of Collective Data. And they're really looking at the importance of legislation and the role that that plays within the design of our cities. So how can we create places that are kind of informed by citizens' assemblies and community decision making? How do we kind of transform the ownership of data and land to make it much more collective and community kind of based? And then there's a sort of surprise seventh room, which is the toilet in the basement of the British Pavilion, which we've opened up to the public for the first time. And that's really looking at the importance of public toilets and other infrastructure, and allowing us to actually use and access our public space. And there's a whole series of videos about all of these different rooms and much more information on the British Council's website, where you can also find out more about our fantastic team who we've been working on the designs of each of these rooms. So I think something that Manager and I have been really interested in the development of this project is how increasingly we're sort of seeing the world in binary ways. There's kind of these increasingly isolationist tendencies. There's kind of increasingly good versus evil. And that's in a way how privatised public space has also been framed, sort of between this public as good, private as bad, when in fact we're all living in this kind of middle ground between the two. And so we took this painting by Hieronymus Bosch called The Garden of Earthly Delights, and we sort of reimagined it as our version of privatised public space. And what was really helpful about that painting is that it's set up as a triptych with sort of heaven on the left, hell on the right, and then the middle ground of earth. And we took that to reimagine privatised public space with sort of the utopia of the commons on the left, the dystopia of total privatisation on the right, and then the middle ground that we're all living in between. And that's really allowed us to frame the project and also conversations with people to sort of help break that binary way of thinking. So within the Garden of Privatised Delights, a huge part of the project has been about widening access to this conversation to kind of prevent yet another conversation of architecture for architects. And we sort of recognise that in kind of addressing public space and sort of helping communities to take ownership over their public space, we really do need different stakeholders, communities, landowners, policymakers to be part of this conversation to see sort of really meaningful change. And so a lot of what we've been doing is bringing those different groups together around the table. I think it's really important to involve communities and local people in design from the earliest stages. You know, no one knows their local area like the people who live there. And it's really beneficial, I think, to both the design of a place and how that evolves to have those kind of voices informing that process and that journey. But it also means that you'll probably create a more successful piece of city in the long term because, you know, you've had that kind of guidance from, you know, that real kind of local knowledge to help you along the way. And I think there's kind of lots of ways you can involve people in that design process. And I think something that's really important is to go beyond just this kind of tick box exercise of community engagement, but to make it really meaningful. So, for example, I've done benchmaking workshops with local community groups where you get very different conversations about what people would like to see in their local area, and you get very different kinds of people attending these workshops than you do when it's just sort of dry kind of A1 boards of a potential development where a lot of decisions have already been taken. That's this kind of tick box consultation method. So I think there's a lot of kind of room for us to really rethink what this engagement can be and how it can really start to shape the design of places. How can we test different areas of our cities and what they could become sort of, you know, I think over the last year, for example, it's been amazing to see local communities take control and ownership of their streets again, like creating play streets or putting planters in the streets to slow down traffic. And, you know, how do we encourage this and allow people to take that ownership over their local area to allow it to be sort of more inclusive and for everyone and ultimately for the people who live there? So I do think often people bring architects and designers into the conversation too late. And I think a lot of our project in Venice, but also my other work, for example, with the National Infrastructure Commission, where I'm on the design group, is really exploring how can architects be a part of the conversation from the earliest, most strategic stages. I think architects are sort of quite uniquely placed that we can be part of a conversation at different scales. So from the kind of urban kind of city scale right the way down to the detailed design of like a warm timber handrail in a train station, you know, we've kind of got this kind of skill set which allows us to mix between these different scales. And with the National Infrastructure Commission's design group, for example, we've been looking at how can we embed design into the decision making sort of very early on in projects and all the way through. So we've come up with these design principles which are climate, people, places, value. And these principles are to be used on all nationally significant infrastructure projects across the United Kingdom going forwards. And that feels like something really exciting because it's allowing everyone to sort of understand that they actually have a say in the design of our cities. No matter what your role is in a project, you actually do have some kind of control in how you're managing that design, how you're allowing design to be part of the process, and how you're bringing us in. And so, yeah, I'd really encourage everyone to allow us designers and architects into the conversation at an earlier stage, and understand that you are also all designers in your own way. Yeah, so those principles of climate, people, places, value, they're really principles that we want to guide everyone in their work. That we think these are things that people should be thinking about throughout not only the design process, but decision-making processes. I mean, one of the reasons I became involved with the National Infrastructure Commission in the first place was I was kind of just getting so confused in practice why often I'd be given a site and it felt like so many decisions had been made before a brief even came our way. And by the time we received that brief, it would be like the site's in the wrong place. Who even made these decisions? And so I became really interested in how can actually I get involved in that decision-making process to ensure, we're finding the right places for things to be, but also who's actually making these decisions. How does it all work? And that was kind of my intro into the National Infrastructure Commission, where I was on their Young Professionals panel for a while. And now I'm on the design group. And so these principles, they're really trying to guide everyone, architects and designers, engineers, clients, local authorities. It's really everyone who's part of these processes of transforming our cities, and our urban environment and infrastructure ultimately, and all kind of parts of infrastructure as well, not just kind of trains and roads, but water, all the different facets, digital, all the different facets of infrastructure. How can we make sure that we're putting climate at the core? That we are really addressing the climate crisis and considering this in everything we do, whether that's specifying materials which are more sustainable, whether it's really thinking about the implications of something in the long term, whether it's about thinking about how our climate is changing and how do we sort of mitigate risks, therefore, to communities of flooding and things like that. Then people, really putting people at the heart of what we're doing. Infrastructure is all about people, and how do we allow communities to be part of the design process of what's going on around them, and how do we allow our designs to work harder so that we're not just using infrastructure to take you from A to B, but it's a journey to be really enjoyed. How do we bring that extra level of value to a place? And there are lots of really interesting examples in Tokyo, for example, where, for example, a seawall, which is a flood defense mechanism, might also become an opportunity to provide allotments for people living in sort of these high-rise tower blocks without much outdoor space. Or a water recycling facility might become an additional opportunity to provide a park, because you're in this very kind of densely urbanated part of a city, and you have to have a water recycling facility which sort of clears a bit of the city, and suddenly you've got this opportunity for some outdoor space for people to enjoy. And that in turn sort of then looks at how we designing our places to be less lonely, to improve our mental and physical health, and really maximizing opportunities for green spaces for people to contemplate and gather. And so really looking at how do we bring people to the heart of that. And I suppose that sort of ties into the place value as well, that these are all places, and how do we sort of make sure that we're responding to places in a locally specific way and really enhancing a place when we're building new infrastructure for it or within it. And then finally, value, which is really looking at how do we use our infrastructure to bring value to places. And it's thinking about value as much more than just something that's financial, but it's also about value in terms of our mental health and well-being, really looking at how we can start to redefine value and have a much longer term kind of vision on what value is, that it's not just an immediate kind of financial return, but it's about really creating places that are successful and kind of all the other things that therefore relate to that. If you create a place that's improving people's mental and physical health and well-being, that has like a whole load of onset impacts, which really create better value for a place. I think something I love about working with young people is how they really challenge your perceptions of a place. Um, Over the past kind of 10-15 years, I've run a lot of workshops with young people and local community groups, including with Manager, where we've run a series of workshops for National Saturday Club Trust. And through those, really worked with young people to explore their local kind of places they feel threatened in, places they feel welcomed in, places that are just completely missing in where they live. And I think often a lot of assumptions are made about what young people would like to see. But in fact, these are completely kind of sort of these swathing assumptions, which therefore don't actually give them anywhere to be in a city. And that's really what VPPR have been exploring in the British Pavilion. And also, there's sort of a lot of really interesting studies out there. There's one by White Architecture called Places for Girls, which looks at how often we see like a lot of kind of very active areas being created for young people and teenagers. But in fact, there are a whole load of teenagers, usually female teenagers. I was certainly one of them, who just want to kind of hang around with their mates and just sit and do nothing. And there just aren't those places in the city for them anymore, particularly with the sort of huge closure of youth centres. So how do we provide spaces for those young people to inhabit and be in on their own terms? How do we design with young people rather than for them? And another project which we're involved in is called the People's Pavilion, which is at Here East in Stratford. It's a project that's being led by Beyond the Box consultants, and it's looking at creating a pavilion that's it'll be up in the summer, and it'll be the first pavilion in London that's designed, built, and curated by young people. And Neil from the Beyond the Box has sort of organised this whole series of workshops to kind of allow this relationship between young people and professionals to help guide them on their way, but really actually ultimately allow them to take control of this space and show us what it is that they would like to see. And I think these kinds of projects are really important. Young people are our future. We have to treat them with respect, but also we have to value that they have so much to contribute to the conversation. Thank you again for having me. And yeah, if you'd like to talk further about anything, feel free to drop me a line on madelinekessler.com or Twitter or Instagram, and hope to be able to meet you all soon.